2,000 years ago, 4 men each wrote a book about a man who changed the world. This man was a powerful teacher, a healer, a miracle worker. Thousands followed him. They hung on his every word. They saw the amazing things he did. This man's name is Jesus.
So, do you think we can trust what the Bible says about Jesus?
No.
I've heard the Bible's been changed, that it's been altered in some way. There's some good information there, but can we trust it? I don't think we can be sure.
I haven't really looked into it, so I can't be certain. I haven't read it, but I want to read it.
What do you think? Can we trust what the Bible says about Jesus?
Jesus and the Bible. That's a hard question.
That's a good question.
If you open a Bible, what do you find? Books within a book, history books, poetry, intriguing prophecies, revolutionary teaching. Books gathered into the Old Testament and the New Testament. And right at the beginning of the New Testament, the 4 accounts of the life of Jesus, written by 4 men. Matthew, John, Mark, and Luke. But how can we be sure that what they wrote 2,000 years ago is what we read in a Bible today? And what is it that they tell us about Jesus?
We have a number of accounts of the birth, the life, the suffering, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus in the 4 stories of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He was born in Bethlehem. We find also that he was, with his family at an early age, a refugee in Egypt, and the Egyptian people still remember that and honor it.
The family finally settled in northern Palestine, in a dusty hillside town called Nazareth, not far from the Sea of Galilee. Jesus' father was a carpenter, and like all boys, Jesus learned a trade. But he chose a different path. At the age of 30, Jesus left home and became a teacher, traveling from place to place with a message of hope for all who would listen.
Much is known about his life, his teachings, which have inspired so many people down the centuries, not only Christians, but many other people. His miracles are widely known. Both Christians and non-Christians have confidence in Jesus as someone who worked miracles, never for himself incidentally, but for people in need. When Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, he was greeted by the crowds as the Messiah who was expected. And he continued with his teaching and his work in Jerusalem, but there was more and more animosity towards him by the leaders, political and social and religious. This eventually led to his arrest and his suffering at the hands of the Jewish people, but also the Romans, and to his execution on the cross, a particularly cruel way of putting someone to death.
Jesus' death was not the end of the story. Matthew, John, Mark, and Luke all tell us that 3 days later, Jesus came back. His grave was empty. The news spread quickly. More than 500 people saw him after his resurrection. He was with his followers in Jerusalem and Galilee. He spent time with them, ate meals with them, and taught them who he really was. Finally, his followers watched him ascend into heaven. What happened next was equally remarkable. The number of Jesus' followers increased rapidly. Only a few months after his resurrection, we know that there were as many as 5,000 men, plus women and children. Many of these people had gathered in Jerusalem from Rome, Greece, Turkey, North Africa, and the Middle East. And when these first Christians returned home with their new faith, the numbers increased again. Churches sprang up all around the Mediterranean, congregations of believers from many different nations.
Well, initially, the church began as a small movement centred around Jesus himself with his disciples working in first century Palestine. But then very quickly it grew into the west with the missions, particularly of the Apostle Paul, who went into modern day Turkey and then even further west. And it also expanded into the south, into Egypt, and we know less about this, but also into the east. So certainly we have records from the 3rd century which talk about the expansion of Christianity into India.
Communication was essential to the first Christians, and the excellent infrastructure of the Roman Empire made it easy for them.
The ancient world was very well equipped for travel, particularly where its roads were concerned. Right up until the modern period, its roads were unequaled in quality. They were paved, they were wide, they were suitable for carriages and horses as well as travelers on foot.
Catching a boat from Jerusalem, from Caesarea, the port, to Rome, in that route might take 40 days, something like that, with good winds. Actually, the reverse way is quicker. Prevailing winds are better from the west, so that's often 2 weeks, 3 weeks to come back from Rome.
If you wanted to communicate with someone on the other side of the Roman Empire, you would send a trusted envoy to carry the letter for you. Someone would write with a stylus on a piece of papyrus, write the address on the back of the little roll of papyrus and send it off with a trusted envoy who could then deliver it to the church which was going to receive it.
The early churches of the 1st century were not isolated communities. We know that messages of encouragement, letters of instruction, information and news passed back and forth.
37 AD, Emperor Tiberius died, and news reached Jerusalem within 5 weeks of his death. So that's a mark of how quick things could travel.
Christians were quick to take advantage of new technology.
Indeed, the story of the Bible is the story of technological progress, because at first there were papyrus scrolls that had to be rolled up and were rather bulky to carry around. Then there were little notebooks that people had put together, and the virtue in them was that the papyrus could be written on both sides. And then there were the parchment codices that were even more convenient, and then printing.
Late in the 15th century, a man named Gutenberg invents the printing press. We begin the process of having printed books. In the earliest printing, things aren't mass-produced. Erasmus's Greek New Testament, we know, sold 3,300 copies, the first ever published Greek New Testament. So that would be a very good print on 3,000. But in the 18th century, early 1710 or so on, there is a printing press. We know it produced 3 million copies of the Scripture. The Bible is the world's best-selling book.
Matthew, John, Mark, Luke. Who were they? Why should we trust them? Matthew and John were close friends of Jesus. Matthew was an educated man, good with numbers, a tax collector for the Roman rulers. John was a fisherman with influential friends in Jerusalem. Mark and Luke were among the first Christians. Mark was an interpreter for Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends, who went to Cyprus and Rome to tell others about Jesus. Luke was a doctor who travelled with some of the first Christians through Turkey and into Europe with the same message.
We know, for example, that Mark, Matthew, Luke and John, they really believed in Jesus. They really believed he was the Son of God. They really believed that everybody should put their trust in him.
These four men wrote in Greek using reed pens and charcoal ink on scrolls, long lengths of papyrus sheets glued together, some as long as 10 meters. Papyrus grows in the marshlands of Egypt, a tall reed up to 3 meters in length with a sticky white pith. For thousands of years, this plant has been harvested and used to make thin, flexible pages suitable for writing on. In the 1st century, papyrus was a vital commodity for communication. Rolls of papyrus were not the only form of writing material available to 1st century scribes. Notebooks, individual sheets of papyrus sewn or glued together, were an innovation.
In early Christianity, you get a transition between the roll and the book, and almost all of our early Christian material is in a book form, whereas the secular literary texts, the classics, the Homer, Euripides, Demosthenes, these sort of texts remain on rolls until the 3rd, 4th century. And when people first started making books, they simply took a roll, chopped it up again, and created a book by putting all the sheets in one and then folding it. So it's a book form.
Notebooks were cheaper to produce, easier to carry and read, simpler to copy. Like other important manuscripts, the accounts of Jesus' life by Matthew and John, Mark and Luke were copied and passed on to the churches. In the right conditions, these papyrus documents could still be read a century after they were written. In the dry deserts of Egypt, some of this material has survived, and we can read it today.
The New Testament on papyrus is extant in large numbers. We have around the list goes up to 122. That's the latest list of early material on papyrus, reflecting portions at least of the New Testament writings. Some of those we do have complete books of John, complete books of Luke and John together. We have a manuscript with Matthew, Mark, Luke, John and the book of Acts.
And the oldest document we have is old enough to have been copied from an original manuscript. An extremely significant portion of John's account is on show in a museum in Manchester, in the north of England.
I'm standing in front of the famous fragment of St. John's Gospel, which is probably the earliest surviving piece of a New Testament in the world. It dates from the early 2nd century AD, so we're talking about a date of around 125, give or take 20 years. Maybe 30 or 40 years after the Gospel was first composed, but it's as close as we will get to that original text. It's written on both sides, which indicates that this is a leaf from a book. And it is in fact one of the very first books in existence. The passage is where Christ is questioned by Pontius Pilate just before the crucifixion. Pilate asks Jesus what is truth, and we actually have the Greek word aletheia on the reverse of the fragment. The fragment is hugely important for our understanding of the composition and spread of the New Testament, and particularly of John's Gospel at a comparatively early date.
There are over 120 papyrus documents, fragments and longer pieces that we have today. But in addition to these, there are about 300 or so parchment codices, and these range from the 4th century right up to the 10th or 11th centuries.
From around the 3rd century, we have a kind of transition in the evidence, where the papyrus continues to be used for the New Testament manuscripts, but also animal skin, what we call parchment, sometimes vellum. Parchment is used for the production of books, and they're much stronger books. As all of a sudden in the 3rd and 4th century, you can create a book which contains a large number of documents, which previously had to be separate. The whole New Testament could be contained within a parchment book. The whole Bible, Greek Old Testament and Greek New Testament, could be contained in the vast Greek Bibles produced in the 4th and 5th century. Papyrus survives only in the dry sands of Egypt. Parchment survives in libraries around the world.
St. Catherine's Monastery sits at the foot of one of the world's most sacred mountains, Mount Sinai in Egypt. In 1844, Dr. Konstantin von Tischendorf, a German researcher, visited the monastery and rescued a bundle of parchment sheets from burning. They were portions of an ancient Bible. 15 years later, he visited again, and on his final evening was astounded to be shown a copy of a Bible held in the safekeeping of the monastery steward, a huge sheaf of parchment leaves wrapped in a red cloth. Now known as the Codex Sinaiticus, this great book was an immensely significant piece of evidence for the reliability of the New Testament accounts of Jesus. Tischendorf persuaded the monastery to part with this precious possession, and he carried it to Russia for copying and publishing. In 1933, the Russian government sold the manuscript to Britain. Now it is housed in the British Library in London.
Well, one of the most important parchment codices of the New Testament, in fact the whole Bible, is the Codex Sinaiticus. I have a copy of it here. And this is a 4th century parchment codex, initially containing originally the whole Greek Bible. It's a fantastic piece of book technology, one of our great treasures, really.
There are some Greek and Roman authors where there are a lot of manuscripts in evidence for them. So, for example, Homer, one of the greatest of the classical poets, has survived in hundreds of pieces of fragments. But in general, Roman historians only survive in a handful of copies, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 copies, sometimes very late copies. But with the New Testament, we have hundreds of fragments and some complete manuscripts from very, very close to the time of the 4 Gospels, the 4 accounts of Jesus' life having been written.
We have manuscripts of a good type, substantial manuscripts, from every century. It's one of the great things that separates the New Testament from anything else, evidence from down the centuries. Good manuscripts from the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, every century. So that what goes into a modern scholarly Greek New Testament is based not only on 500 years of study, but actually on manuscripts that go back, 1800 years to the 2nd century.
We know that complete accounts of Jesus' life are found on parchment codices of the 4th century. And there's an extraordinary amount of evidence in papyrus documents, dated only decades after the first accounts were written. All proof that the Jesus accounts we read today are the same as those written 2,000 years ago. But why did early Christians trust these accounts? Like us, they wanted to know the real story. Luke is adamant he has done thorough research.
Reports of these things were handed down to us. There were people who saw these things for themselves from the beginning and then passed the word on.
John's account is verified as true by others. They added this to what he had written.
We know that what he said is true.
The stories about Jesus are eyewitness accounts, based on eyewitness accounts. They're not fables that developed after Jesus died, a long time later. People are writing down what they saw, what others reported to them, what was known. The Gospels provide us with Jesus interacting with known historical persons. We do find names of particular characters, sometimes in particular locations. Blind Bartimaeus, who's met by Jesus on the road and who's healed by Jesus. Now, we know his name, but plenty of other blind men who meet Jesus, we don't know their names. Why do we know that name? Is it quite likely, I think, because actually it was Bartimaeus who added his testimony to the other stories. Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross on the road to Golgotha. And Mark says, he was the father of Rufus and Alexander. Well, why do we know about Rufus? Well, they must have been members of a Christian community. They must have been connected. This personal connection is absolutely critical. The recent work done on this that shows the names of people in the Gospels fit exactly with what we know about proportions and construction of names in the first century.
The reason that the Christians were able to recognize Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the authentic stories about Jesus was precisely because they were connected with people who knew Jesus personally, who had been with him, who had heard his teaching, who had seen the miracles, who knew about the cross, and most importantly, who knew about his rising again.
The four accounts of Jesus in the New Testament give a very realistic picture of first century Palestine in what they say about the temple, in what they say about the festivals, and in the way they agree also with Jewish and Roman historians about what happened to Jesus in his lifetime. The events of Jesus' trial and death are anchored in historical reality. We know from sources outside of the New Testament that Caiaphas, who's the high priest recorded in the four accounts of Jesus' life, was high priest at the time. From archaeological evidence, such as his tomb, we know that the Roman governor of Palestine at the time, Pontius Pilate, we know that he was governor at the time because a Roman historian called Tacitus records that.
Geographically, they are accurate. They describe the life of the times. They have not been written from somewhere else, as it were, because of the intimate knowledge that they have of the culture and the context.
Recognition of the trustworthiness of these accounts started early. Matthew and Mark's accounts are mentioned together around AD 110. Luke's account was definitely being used in churches earlier than AD 140. At around AD 180, one of the early church leaders, Irenaeus, based in France, confirmed the grouping of Matthew, John, Mark, and Luke together. This substantial manuscript contains all four books and is dated early in the 3rd century.
In the 4th century, we finally have a recognition of the books that are being used by the Christians. This isn't an invention, this decision to canonize, to call authoritative certain books of the New Testament, but it was a recognition of what had been used by Christians all along. The New Testament has been subjected to very detailed investigation, much more detailed probably than any other Greek or Roman piece of literature, and it stood the test of time.
The evidence for the reliability of these four Jesus accounts, based on the early New Testament manuscripts we have found, is very strong. But there are many other ancient documents which provide even more evidence.
It's true that there are other fields of our knowledge of the New Testament, that is, early church writers, Christian leaders in different cities throughout the Roman Empire, from the 2nd century, 3rd, 4th century, who were themselves scholars of the Bible and the New Testament, and who quoted vast numbers.
Augustine, writing at the end of the 4th century, uses a staggering 29,000 quotations from the New Testament. From the Jesus accounts alone, Eusebius uses over 3,200 references. Origen more than 9,000. Tertullian nearly 4,000 quotes. Clement 1,100. Justin Martyr, one of the earliest church leaders, uses over 260 quotes.
One of my favourite characters is Didymus the Blind, a blind church leader in Alexandria, who, being blind, obviously had to memorise huge swathes of the Bible and preached and wrote commentaries on that. We have plenty of his commentaries where he just quotes the scriptures from memory in a way that entirely comports with our great our great manuscripts.
We have an incredible 31,000 quotes from the New Testament written by early church leaders no later than 260 AD. Over half of these are taken from the 4 accounts of Jesus. We also have ancient translations of the New Testament. With the growth of the church, new believers wanted the Jesus accounts in their own languages. These manuscripts confirm that believers in numerous countries of Europe and the Middle East shared the same Christian beliefs.
Of course, we've got the church as it grows in the 2nd and 3rd century. Already you have the need for the Bible to be translated into new languages. So we have the New Testament translated to Latin. We have the New Testament translated into Syriac for use in the East, in Syria and further east. We have the New Testament translated into Coptic and Coptic dialects in Egypt and southern Egypt. And as the church expands, in a sense, we have immense resources in these translated forms of the scriptures. And that goes on and on throughout history. Even today, the Bible has been translated to more languages.
One of the big changes in the last 100 years has been the explosion of translations of the Bible into hundreds of different languages, and not only in written form, but we can also get the Bible now on CD, in recorded form, and also on the internet as well.
When we look at the evidence for the reliability of the 4 accounts of Jesus, written by Matthew and John, Mark and Luke, we find that we have more manuscripts, more translations into more languages, and more quotations than any other 1st century writings. There are complete collections from every century back to the 4th, and fragments and portions of books from a time when the original documents could still have been in existence. When we ask a simple question, the accounts of Jesus, written 2,000 years ago by Matthew and John, his close friends, and by Mark and Luke, his first followers, are they the same as those we read in the New Testament today? We can be confident they are.